Hi there everyone, and welcome to this paper 2 question 4 video tutorial for the GCSE AQA English language qualification. For this video I'm going to be referring to what's known I think as the Death Zone paper or the London Snow paper. I have done some videos on this paper before, but not question 4 before, in which we are comparing the writers' perspectives about the snow, really, the weather conditions in each writer's respective setting. For question 4, I always get my students to follow this 5-step process. Once you have read the question and then read the extracts, the first thing that I always ask students to do is ask themselves whether this is a positive or negative attitude, or it could also be slightly nuanced, it could be a little bit of both. Once they have figured out whether it's positive or negative or both, I then ask them to find 3 or 4 quotes from each extract to prove that that is what their perspective or their attitude is. Then I will ask them to look only at the bits that they've highlighted, those quotes, and to analyse the methods in those quotes. I will then ask them to label some feelings as to what those quotes suggest the writer feels. They might be angry or critical or judgmental or skeptical and so on. And then finally, I suppose the important bit is to ask yourself, number 5 there, why? So why might the writers have this outlook? What has happened to them? Who are they? As to the reason why they have reacted to something in this particular way. In other words, what has formed their opinion on the issue. For this question, remember that you will not be comparing the weather, as you've done that for question 2. You are comparing what each writer thinks about the weather. So, in other words, their opinions, their views, and their perspectives. And for the question, the exam board could choose any one of those words, but essentially it is the same. And just a reminder there of that 5-step process that I have just gone through. And then all of those 5 steps will then come together to form a response, because each of those 5 steps are designed to help you go into detail with your answer. So I'm going to finish this presentation by showing you an example answer, which I've also color coded as to why that answer is particularly effective. Okay. So the first thing that you obviously will need to do is to read the question, and then you will obviously need to read the extracts. And usually for this question, they will ask you to read whole extract. If you think about it, by the time that you have started this question, you will have already done 3 other questions on these extracts, and therefore by this point you've almost spent an hour on them, and you will be slightly an expert on them really, because you have used them for almost an hour by this point. Excuse me. But it's also a good idea to read the whole thing again in case you haven't. That will obviously refresh your recollection about what is going on. For this video, I'm not going to read the extracts to you because I think it would take too long. But you can obviously pause this video and to read this. This is source A, and source A is by Matt Dickinson, and it's all about the horrific weather conditions and how he's on Mount Everest with a group of climbers, and the weather suddenly changes and it's very dramatic and also has fatal consequences. So as you get to the second half of this extract, we're told, for example, that 8 climbers, I think, were killed, and it was a very fatal incident with this storm that came rolling in. So that's source B. This is the 21st century extract, and obviously if you have this in front of you, I would encourage you to read it now and then to highlight it and to engage with it. We're then comparing it to source B, and this is source B. Source B is actually a diary entry, or a couple of diary entries from the 1800s, from the Victorian era, written by a man called Arthur Munby. And Arthur Munby is not in an extreme place like Everest, he's in London. And it's unusual to get a lot of snowfall in London or cities because obviously it's supposed to be warmer in them. And obviously the concrete sometimes holds on to the heat. So for this writer, seeing snow in London is actually quite a novelty. He actually enjoys it to begin with. He actually really likes how pretty it is and how beautiful it is, and how it made London stop for a few days, and the hustle and bustle had all stopped, and instead was what he says here which was the loveliness and utter purity of new fallen snow. So again, that's Arthur Mumby. That's his 2nd of January entry. But then the second half of the extract is an entry that he wrote 2 days later on the Friday. And this is when his attitude begins to change, because he starts to get a little bit fed up with the snow, because it's starting to have an impact on him. Arguably, the impact is not going to be as severe as the impact of the weather on source A, but it is still an impact. For example, his beard froze. He says he felt a little bit paralysed because of how it seemed to stop his heart. He had a headache, we're told, as well. So even though the weather conditions are slightly more trivial than source A, there is still an impact of the weather on people that experience it. So that's source B. So what you'll have to ask yourself now, once you've read both sources, is this a positive or a negative attitude of the weather, or is it both? And then what you're doing is you're finding the quotes to prove that that is their attitude. So for example, if source A is a negative attitude of the weather, then we need to find evidence to prove that's the case, and so on. Okay. So the question is, compare how the writers convey their different perspectives on the extreme weather conditions. If we put that into simple speak, it means compare and contrast what the writers think of the weather. That's what it means, and for 16 marks we're aiming to write about 16 minutes. These points here are things that I would encourage students to use as an introductory paragraph. Not a long introductory paragraph, albeit, but one that really contextualizes very nicely what we are reading, because the experiences and the perspectives of the writers are different because they are experiencing different things. So we would need to say something like Matt Dickinson is on a climbing expedition to scale Mount Everest, and there is very serious weather conditions there. But the reason why people go climbing in these extreme places is because they are challenging human endurance, and they want to see what humans can achieve, even in places where they're not supposed to be. So you can argue with source A that the weather conditions are part of the challenge. However, in source B, Arthur Mumby is just walking around London, and he is simply describing the snow and how it transforms the city and how it looks. But as we've said, the snow is nowhere near as dangerous, and with only minor annoyances felt. And because he's more familiar with the city, I believe Arthur Mumby is a Londoner, it means that he isn't going to be as dramatic or hyperbolic or exaggerating in terms of how he describes the snow, because he's familiar with that setting. And obviously cities are often more populated than Everest, so it's not going to be difficult to find people if you need help. Something that you will also always tend to find is that both sources tend to be written in the first person, so they're from the personal perspective of the I. And therefore, because you are talking here about perspectives, it's always a good thing to say that both texts are written in the first person, which is conveying the writer's personal experiences, perspectives, and memories. And that is also methods, and if you can get that in the introduction, it would look very impressive. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go through each source and basically break it down following those 5 steps that I spoke about earlier. So we've already ascertained that source A is a negative attitude of the weather because it can be a case of life and death. He feels very vulnerable. And source B is more positive and then changes to more negative 2 days later on the Friday. So those are the general perspectives, but we need to go into a little bit more detail. So in order to find quotes, these are some of the quotes that you could use in order to prove what their perspectives are. So Matt Dickinson, for example, in source A says he was watching in awe as the apocalyptic vision crept silently. The storm whipped into camp, ripping into the tents. He heard the roar of the winds and the scream of the storm, and we're told that there were a total of 8 fatalities. So those are quotes that you could use. There are others as well, but these are just some examples. And then we can compare that to some of the language in source B. So in source B, we have this long list of quite positive adjectives, beautiful, quiet, loveliness, wondrous, lovely, picturesque, quaint, and so on. And then towards the end of the extract, he says, my beard froze and the nape of my neck, heart seemed paralysed, headache, I was almost helpless. So those are some of the evidence that you could use. That is some of the evidence you could use in order to prove what their perspectives are and to explain to the examiner what they think of the weather conditions. to bring in some methods, because in order to get the high marks, remember, we've got to be able to talk about how, and how is always the writer's method. So what I've done here is for source A, I have basically broken down the 4 quotes and told you some of the methods. So we've got an adjective, apocalyptic, we've got verb crept, adverb silently, which is personification. We've got some verbs there, whipped and ripping. We've got nouns, roar and scream, which is quite onomatopoeic. And then in number 4 there, we've got a declarative sentence made of that statistic 8, which is obviously being used by the writer to make it seem very fatal and serious. So in order to get higher to 16 marks, we need to be able to tie in some of these purple words as well. Similarly for source B, same thing. A whole bunch of adjectives here that the writer uses, as well as 3 nouns, or to push it even further, you might say abstract nouns, because they're words that they're things that we cannot touch. They're more concepts, I suppose. We've got a couple of adjectives, paralysed, helpless, and a declarative, my beard froze, as well. So again, we need to be able to tie these purple words in order to be able to get the higher marks. Next, we need to come up with some words to describe what their attitudes are in relation to the weather. So source A's attitude is he sees the snow as dangerous, as savage, as severe, vicious, malevolent, awestruck though at nature's power. Whereas source B's attitude is more pleasant, evocative, satisfying, complimentary, admires the snow, but 2 days later starts to get a little bit more annoyed with it and sees it as slightly more unpleasant. So we need to be talking about the writer's perspective. We're not just describing the snow again, remember. We have to talk about what the writer thinks of the snow. And these are all words which describe really how the writers think of the snow and the weather conditions. So that also needs to be tied in as well to our response. We also then need to think about why, and again, this is where you can start to expand and use some inferent, perhaps some more indirect or implicit interpretations. So, like we've said, source A is set in a wilderness, it's set in the middle of nowhere, so there's nobody around. That can intensify a sense of drama or a sense of seriousness, because if you get into trouble, there's nobody there to help you. It's a more unforgiving environment, as we've said. And because they are climbing Everest, they want to push human endurance and the extremes of human survival. So again, that's part of it. That's part of the challenge. But he also, Matt Dickinson looks at the climbers that have been killed, the 8 of them, and he realizes that he's no less vulnerable than they are. He's in no kind of, he's not protected. So it could happen to him as well. So he is also concerned, but also aware that Mother Nature is far more powerful than he is. He is not superior, and he could also very easily end up like the 8 climbers who were also killed. Whereas source B, the writer is more familiar with the city. He knows where he's walking around, he can still make out where things are, it's just that everything has a very pretty blanket of snow on everything. And for him to begin with, the snow enhances the appearance of the city rather than making it perilous. But as the days progress and we go 2 days later, his viewpoint starts to change, because the snow goes from being something to see as something pleasant to something that's more discomforting. And he starts to feel lots of minor inconveniences, like a frozen beard, a headache, a cold neck. So we need to also tie in, why do the writers have the viewpoints that they do? We can't just say, well, writer A thinks this, writer B thinks that. We've got to say why. What position are they in? What perspective do they have? What experiences are they having, which might, create the which informs the kind of viewpoints that they have. So it's important to also tie in the why as well. So that is all kind of to do with breaking down the extract. And I would always say to students that obviously while they're learning this question, you can't go straight into writing it in the exam, but even in the lesson either. And it's important to really decode and annotate and highlight the extracts before you write the response, because once you've done all the hard work in terms of annotating the extracts, it's much easier to actually write the response. And the response is what I'm going to show you next. And what I've done is I've color-coded it to show you what is particularly effective about this response. So if we start with the introductory paragraph, the pink or purple here, I think it's pink, is all to do with showing the exam that I'm comparing, but the yellow is all to do with showing that I'm already starting to think about the attitudes or the perspectives of the writers. So it says both writers convey different perspectives on the extreme weather conditions, more specifically the snowfall in their respective places. Matt Dickinson is a seasoned climber who might be used to these extreme conditions as part of the challenge of climbing inhospitable environments to test human endurance. So for him to express such shock at the weather suggests it must be severe. However, Arthur Mumby is a city dweller and perhaps not used to the snow, which is why he sees it more as a pleasant novelty to be enjoyed at first. Despite these differences, both writers use the first person to convey personal memories and experiences of the conditions. So, really impressive introduction. I'm talking about both extracts. I'm comparing. I'm already starting to talk about attitudes, and I'm also using, quite impressive words like inhospitable, pleasant, novelty, endurance. So that shows some conviction and some perception in what I'm saying. And I've obviously finished there with talking about some methods, the first person, to convey those memories and experiences. So this is all about contextualizing who the writers are and what situation are they in. The next paragraph is all about source A, and again I've color coded it into three colors. The green is the methods, the blue are the quotes, and the yellow is the attitudes of the writer or the perspectives or the viewpoints of the writers. So it says Dickinson's language suggests that he finds the snow on Everest as dangerous, savage, and malevolent, conveyed through the adjective apocalyptic, suggesting he believes the approaching storm appears dystopian and like the end of the world due to the dark clouds. The verb crept and adverb silently suggest that he is conveying his awareness of Mother Nature having evil intentions because of the sinister and predatory way the storm is approaching, hiding its true power. This might be something he is in awe of, despite him being at the mercy of the conditions. Dickinson is in the middle of nowhere, so it is no wonder that he feels nervous and concerned about being out in the elements in these conditions, where verbs whipped and ripping convey how Mother Nature can destroy things easily that humans need for shelter and survival. Onomatopoeic nouns, roar and scream, reinforce the dramatic sound of the storm, adding to Dickinson's anxiety and sense of drama. The declarative sentence "total of 8 fatalities" finalises Dickinson's concern about how the weather can exterminate human life easily, reminding us of our own mortality. I believe he is probably worried because he realises the climbers who were killed are in the same position as him, so he sees his life as just as fragile and in real jeopardy by being exposed in this wilderness. So that's all about source A. We've got impressive words like dystopian, which means nightmarish and unpleasant. We've got something else I wanted to clarify as well, which I can't find now. But you can also see how we've got some quotes in there consistently. We've got lots of consistent green methods as well. And we've also got lots of effort there to really describe or to analyse what Dickinson's attitudes are in yellow. So again, he is clearly this candidate, this student is clearly being able to talk about what they think, not just describing the weather. So whereas he feels obviously very, I suppose, fragile about this weather conditions, he also is kind of in awe of Mother Nature's power, because Mother Nature obviously does have great power to destroy things very quickly. So again, the student really does go into that detail as well, which is again very impressive. So that is source A, and we've also got words like predatory in there. Again, this idea that the storm is almost like a predator, almost preying on these weak and vulnerable climbers. So that is source A, and then we need to compare this obviously to source B. Same colours, and we've now got some comparisons in pink. In contrast, Mumby's perspective of the London snow is that it's less severe and dramatic. Mumby's language suggests he feels the snow is evocative, beautiful and pleasant, partly seen through the repetition of adjectives such as wondrous, lovely and quaint, and nouns, loveliness, cleanliness and brightness. It is obvious that Mumby does not see the snow as a threat to his life like Dickinson, and that Mumby is more complimentary about the snow because of how Mother Nature can make everything seem beautiful. Perhaps he is a city dweller, so he is used to living in a highly populated place where help would not be too far away, unlike Dickinson, who has chosen to put himself in an extreme place for the sake of human endurance and challenge. However, 2 days later, Mumba's attitude begins to change when the snow starts to become more of a nuisance and starts to make him feel discomfort and inconvenience. The declarative "my beard froze" and the adjective "paralysed" to describe the impact of the snow on his heart convey a more perilous perspective of the weather. He also says he feels helpless, as if he is in the mercy of the. Sorry. He also says he feels helpless, as if he is at the mercy of the cold weather. It is worth noting that despite his annoyance, the snow and cold is nowhere near as perilous as Dickinson experiences on Everest. Okay, so that's source B there, or at least the paragraph about source B. And you can see again, we've got all the bits of the mark scheme that we need. We've got the methods in green, the quotes in blue, the attitudes and perspectives in yellow, and the comparison in pink. Again, you might have been taught differently in terms of comparisons. There's lots of different ways students are taught about how to write these comparison questions or these comparison responses. Some teachers get them to do a comparison in each paragraph. Some do it very blocky like this. The bottom line is, as long as you're able to talk about both sources and to answer the question, it's okay. So it's really whatever works for you. So for me, I always find that getting students to do it like this in this kind of more blocky approach can sometimes help them go into detail. But again, that's up to your own teacher's discretion, of course. So in summary then, that is what you're aiming for to get an effective response for a good mark for this question. This would get, obviously, I would hope, somewhere about around 12 plus. And if you can get 12 or more out of 16, then you're looking at obviously getting a good mark for this, which would equal a good grade as well, at least a grade 4, which is what you need to get the GCSE. So in summary then, for this question, this response, it's all about comparing the weather conditions. You need to make sure that the 4 aspects of the mark scheme, though in those 4 colours that you can see here on the right, are in your response in order to show the examiner that you are comparing what the writers think of the weather conditions. Thank you.